God sovereignly chose David to be his king over Israel. And God sovereignly chose to not give David what he deserved here. And that's called grace. God's unmerited favor for sinners like you and like me. That's what God's grace looked like. And yet it seems that David lost sight of that. He wasn't striving to convince his heart that God's grace is totally sufficient. And likewise, we can fall into at least two errors when it comes to God's grace. Sometimes we can take grace for granted. We can presume on God's grace. We assume, well, I'm saved, I guess I can do whatever I want. I'm golden. My ticket to heaven is punched. We can take it for granted. We can presume on God's grace. But we can also take God's grace for granted in the sense that we think it's not sufficient. We think there is no way that God's grace can cover what I have done or what I have said. There is no way that God's grace is totally sufficient for me in this season of life to address this thing, this problem, whatever that is in your life. We think there's no way that God's grace is sufficient for that. And so we need to be reminded, and we need to remind our hearts that His grace is sufficient. It is sufficient, and we cannot take it for granted, ever, ever.